Now, in the second video in this three-part series on ancient history, we're going to focus on two major ancient civilizations, those being Greece and China, right? So starting with Greece, the territories of ancient Greece were organized into city-states, and each city-state had its own form of government. So some city-states were dictatorships, like Sparta, and then others were democracies, like Athens. So it was like each city was its own state or kind of like its own country in the larger nation of Greece. Okay, so ancient Greece democracy laid the foundation for the type of government that would later on be adopted by the United States about 2,000 years later. They were the first ones to use democracy. Now, the Greco Persian Wars were some of the first major conflicts in Greek history, and this took place throughout the 400s BC. The Battle of Marathon was one of the major battles here, and that was in 490 BC when the Persians invaded Greece. We already talked about Persia and Greece were arch enemies. So Persia invaded Greece, which was not a unified country at this time. It was just a collection of city-states, as we saw. And so a messenger was sent from Athens to Sparta, which was 26.2 miles away, in order to ask the Spartans for help, because Athens could not defend off the entire empire of Persia all by itself. But by the time the Spartans arrived in Marathon, the Athenians had already defeated the Persians to everyone's great surprise. Now, this was a big turning point, kind of showing that even the biggest empire in the world could be defeated. This is also where we get the concept of the race, the marathon, because the marathon is 26.2 miles, and that is how far away Athens was from Sparta. Okay, if you've ever seen 300, that is where the Spartans were. Now, the movie 300, okay, that is about the Battle of Thermopylae, and the Battle of Thermopylae was also a part of the Greco-Persian Wars. This was in 480 BC, about 10 years after the Battle of Marathon. And in this battle, you had 300 Spartans led by King Leonidas, and they were able to hold off over 100,000 soldiers of the invading Persian army for 7 days. Now, of course, they did not win. You really can't win when you're that outnumbered, but just the fact that they were able to hold off the invading army for so long when they were so outnumbered, it was really, really impressive. Eventually, the vastly outnumbered Spartans were defeated, and Persia took control of a portion of Greece for a short period of time before the Greeks took it back over. But after this battle, the Greeks were able to drive out the Persians, which eventually led to the Persians' withdrawal from all of Europe. And this is really an example of patriotism and the kind of resolve and determination that comes with defending one's home. You have more to lose when you are defending your home than when you are invading somebody else. And now we get to the Peloponnesian War. This was 431 through 404 BC, after the Greco-Persian Wars. This was a war between the Athenians and the Spartans, okay? So the city-states turned on each other, and this was caused by political disunity throughout Greece. So after Sparta won, they were later conquered by Thebes and then Macedon. So they basically set a terrible example of city-states conquering each other when they have disagreements. And seeing the futility of this type of discord within one nation, Philip II, the king of Macedon, united all of Greece as one country. Now, Philip II of Macedon was the father of Alexander the Great, who we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, in addition to democracy, several other things were invented by the ancient Greeks. Okay? Ancient Greece contributed a ton to modern society. They say that Western civilization is built on two great pillars, okay? Greco-Roman culture, meaning ancient Greece and Rome, and Christianity. So Greece produced some of the most beautiful art of all time. This heavily influenced artists during the Roman Empire and in the Renaissance, far after that, and even beyond. Okay, we still see the influence of Greek art and architecture. Greek literature also, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, are considered absolute masterpieces. Still, a lot of people read them. Also, the Olympics started in Greece. Okay, we later on made the modern Olympic Games starting in 1896, and we still have the Olympics every 4 years. The theater arguably had its beginning in Greece with playwrights like Sophocles, and you also had Greek philosophy that was hugely influential throughout the Western world, and it really influenced Western thought. So there were three great philosophers of ancient Greece. You have probably heard their names. Their names were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. An easy way to remember this is SPA, S-P-A. First was Socrates, then his apprentice was Plato. Then Plato mentored Aristotle, and then Aristotle actually was the private tutor of Alexander the Great. So you can add another A on there, SPA, S-P-A-A. All right. And these were hugely influential thinkers, even still today. They really influence the way we reason and think about life and the meaning of the universe. Now, Socrates influenced Western thought by saying the unexamined life is not worth living, basically saying if you don't examine yourself, if you don't try to find out the deeper meanings in life and why we're here and who we are, there's no real purpose. And this really caused people to start thinking about the deeper meaning of things in life. The whole concept of knowledge for the sake of knowledge really began. And he believed in questioning everything. He said, don't ever just believe anything blindly. You got to question everything, all right? Everything, even that you hold dear. Now, Socrates was executed actually for, quote, corrupting the youth of Athens by spreading new ideas, some of which challenged democracy. So he would use the Socratic method, what we know as, and basically try to make people prove, why is democracy the best way? And just for the reason that he questioned democracy, which Athens was very proud of, they had him executed for it by drinking poison. So Plato was the one who wrote down all of the writings and speeches of Socrates, since Plato was his student. And Plato had his own works as well. His most famous is called The Republic. You also may have heard of Plato's Cave. And then you have Aristotle, who was his apprentice, and he wrote several books, including Metaphysics, one of his most famous ones. And they wrote a lot about their thoughts on God, on the unseen, and on the supernatural. Okay? So among other things, they developed the idea that God is impassible, which means without emotions. And this was so influential that it was later adopted by much of Christianity, even though that's not even taught in the Bible. That's how much of an impact they had on the entire Western world, that they literally shaped what certain religions believed, even if it wasn't in their sacred texts. Right? And a lot of Christian theology during the Middle Ages was based in part on Greek philosophy. So Plato and Aristotle each started a school, kind of like a college, a place of higher education, place of learning. Plato had one called the Academy, and Aristotle had one called the Lyceum, and these are considered the world's first colleges. And then you have a guy named Thucydides, who was an ancient Greek historian. Now, he was important to the field of history because he was one of the first historians to record history without including the acts of the supernatural, meaning God or the gods. So before Thucydides, people would write history like this. They would say, Athens defeated Persia in the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC because Zeus was on their side and he helped them win. Okay? And Thucydides said it's not the part of a historian to attribute anything to the supernatural, to God or to the gods, but rather to, put the facts there for you and then let the reader come to their own conclusion about what they believe God's role was in certain historical events. And we still see this to this day. So this is why most historians, even those who are religious, don't include in their writings their beliefs about God's roles in the events of history. Okay, so for example, if you open up your textbook, it's not going to say that, for example, that the Allies won World War II because God was on our side. Now, they might believe that. Historians might believe that. It doesn't mean they're atheists by any means, but that's just not how we do history anymore. We let the reader, we let the historian come up to their own conclusions. So Philip II of Macedon was the one who united all of Greece, and he had a son named Alexander. Alexander was born in 356 BC, and he was tutored by Aristotle. And at age 13, he was able to tame this wild stallion that had become so untamable, basically. Everyone else had concluded that he was untamable, completely wild. They said, we need to kill him so he doesn't kill us all. And Alexander was able to tame him at the age of 13. And he actually rode this horse into battle for the rest of his life. Alexander was famous for having never lost a battle. He is the only major general, successful general in all of world history that never lost a single battle. So Alexander, along with his army, conquered the entire Persian Empire. They had taken over a huge chunk of the world, okay, pretty much all of Southwest Asia, even into parts of Europe, okay? And Alexander, in just a few short years, about a decade, conquered all of the Persian Empire. All that area in the orange was conquered by Alexander and his army. So his empire extended from Greece to North Africa all the way to the border with India. And some historians call him the greatest military general of all time. So Alexander's conquest impacted the world for centuries after his death for a couple of reasons. All right, through his conquering of territories on 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, Alexander not only spread his reign, his empire, but he also spread the Greek language throughout the entire world. So Greek really became kind of a global language. If you were going to learn a second language, Greece really was the language that you probably learned. And so it really became the language of commerce and trade, kind of like how English is today. And this really globalized both trade and communication. It's also the reason why the New Testament was originally written in Greek, because it was written in the territory that Alexander had conquered several hundred years later, though. After Alexander conquered it, it was written. But that really shows his lasting impact because Greek was still used. So while he was victorious in every battle, one weakness of Alexander's was he was a lot like the Babylonians in that he did not rebuild the cities that he conquered. He pretty much just left them in ruins, and this made the territory that he conquered rather weak and very difficult to govern. And so that was not one of his strong points. He was mostly about what's going to look the best on a map. How do I get as much territory as possible? He was much more about quantity rather than quality. All right, so he didn't really invest in his cities that he conquered. And this just goes to show you, no matter how big your empire is, if you cannot govern it effectively, it's not going to last. It's certainly not going to last after you die. So Alexander died at a very young age. He died of a fever when he was only 32 years old. Now, you might think he would die valiantly in a battle, right? But he died in his bed, okay? And he was only 32 years old. And upon his death, almost immediately, his massive kingdom was split into 3 different kingdoms. You had the Antigonids, who controlled his territory in Europe. The Ptolemies took over Egypt and Israel, and then the Seleucids took over his territories in Asia, like modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc. All right, and this was it really went to show how no matter how great of a general you are, if you don't know how to govern properly, your empire is going to break apart when you die, and that's exactly what happened. So while Alexander the Great's empire did not last long after his death, his legacy really did. Okay, he's still famous, very famous to this day, and his actions really influenced the world to a great deal after his death. You had countless military leaders who lived after him. They just obsessed over Alexander. A lot of militaries have modeled their strategies and tactics after him because he was so incredibly successful. Every military general, every soldier wants to be able to say that they never lost a single battle. And so they look to Alexander to try to accomplish that. Also, a lot of world leaders after his death took from him the idea of absolute monarchy. As you remember, Athens and other city-states had really introduced democracy to the world. But once Philip II of Macedon took over all of Greece, you say bye-bye to democracy, and then Alexander really cemented that idea of absolute monarchy in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And this really influenced European history, especially for thousands of years. And that's one reason why democracy was kind of put on a hiatus. It was put on hold for so long after Athens fell. People didn't really take it back up until around the time of the Enlightenment when the United States was formed, 2,000 years later. Several military leaders, as I said, modeled their actions after Alexander the Great. For example, Julius Caesar, who we'll talk about in the next video, he sought to change the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire because he didn't like the idea of republics or democracies, which are similar. He wanted to be an absolute monarch like Alexander the Great, and he wanted to be the emperor. And this idea of absolute monarchy in that region was taken directly from Alexander. Okay? Then you have a guy named Pompey, who was Caesar's enemy. He was so obsessed with Alexander that he modeled his curly hairstyle after him, as you see in that sculpture there. And going all the way to the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte idolized Alexander the Great so much that in 1798 he invaded Egypt. And the reason why he invaded Egypt, because Alexander invaded Egypt and he wanted to do exactly what Alexander the Great had done. All right, so he was massively influential for over 2,000 years after his death. However, Alexander's influence has kind of receded. It's gone away a little bit in Western society in the past century or so. And now it's really because the idea of absolute monarchy has widely been replaced with democracy, or at least constitutional monarchy. Okay, so the whole concept of absolute monarchy is really kind of like a dictatorship these days, and we don't see dictatorships as a good thing anymore. And that's certainly what Alexander was. So we don't really look up to him in that way. Also, the whole idea of conquest for the purpose of territorial expansion, that's largely seen in a very negative conquest now. It's no longer seen as a sign of strong leadership like it was for Alexander the Great. Now it's just seen as kind of cruel. You're seen as a warmonger, someone who just wants needless death if you invade a country just to take over their territory. And even the United States does not tolerate that anymore. Okay, so that's ancient Greece, and now we're going to shift to ancient China. So China is the oldest surviving civilization in the entire world. Its written history goes back more than 3,500 years. And in addition to China's longevity, one thing that is also significant about ancient China is its consistency. China's culture really did not change all that much to a large extent until the 20th century. China still had their line of ancient dynasties in power all the way up until 1911 AD, okay, only about 100 years ago. And Chinese culture was very similar to ancient Chinese culture all the way up until that point. So very impressive how long China has survived without ever having a period where they didn't exist. And also very impressive, or at least significant, that their culture did not change very much up until the 20th century. The governing system in ancient China was the dynastic system. You had dynasties, which were like ruling families that were ruled by emperors. Okay, dynasties are ruled by emperors that come from the same ruling family, very similar to a monarchy, but a more Eastern spin on it. And dynasties would sometimes be taken over and replaced by other families that would then create their own dynasty. So those 3,500 years of history that we just mentioned, that was not all ruled by one dynasty. You had about a dozen different dynasties, because once one dynasty weakens, it can be conquered, taken over by another, or let's say the emperor does not have a child, then their dynasty cannot continue and it needs to be taken over by another ruling family. So you had several different dynasties in ancient China, but the same dynastic system. Most emperors were male, like most world leaders in general, and the goal of each dynasty was political stability. They did not want war, they did not want strife or turmoil in their country while they were ruling. They always wanted things to be stable. So here we're just going to list really quickly the dynasties of ancient China. The first dynasty was the Xia dynasty, but something about the Xia dynasty is it might have been fictional. There is no archaeological evidence that it existed, but it is mentioned in documents by other dynasties that existed hundreds of years after the Xia dynasty allegedly did. So we don't know for sure. It's possible that the Xia existed, but it's also possible it might have been fictional. The first dynasty that we know for sure existed was the Shang dynasty, and this was the first one to leave behind artifacts, leave behind documents. After the Shang was the Zhou dynasty, followed by the Warring States period. Okay, so the Warring States period was a time of political chaos. There was really no dynasty in power. Okay, so this is the time really of the Persian Empire and ancient Greece and Alexander the Great. Okay, during that whole period when all of that was happening in the West, the Warring States period was going on in the East. After that, you had the dynastic system established again, and now you had the Qin dynasty, and that bridges the gap from BC to that only lasted a few years, a couple decades, the Qin dynasty, but it's still very important because that is where we get the name China. Okay, Qin dynasty, China. Then the Han dynasty was the one that bridged the gap from BC to AD. Okay, Han China, followed by the Sui dynasty, then the Tang, the Song, and the Yuan. Now, the Yuan dynasty was significant because they were Mongols. We're going to talk about the Mongols when we start getting into the Middle Ages. And the Mongols conquered the Song dynasty and established their own Chinese dynasty. But eventually, the Yuan dynasty was conquered by the Ming, and the Ming were the ones who built the Great Wall of China in order to keep the Mongols out of China. So there are actually several different walls of China that all kind of connect together, sort of, and they were built by different dynasties. But the bulk of the wall, including the part that everyone knows, okay, that looks familiar to everyone, that was built by the Ming dynasty. Then you have the final dynasty in China. That was the Qing dynasty that lasted all the way until 1911, and they were replaced by a modern government after the revolution of 1911, which we will get to next semester. One famous Chinese philosopher that lived during the Warring States period was named Confucius. There's even an Eastern religion named Confucianism that follows his teachings. So he believed that in order to produce a peaceful, harmonious, smoothly run society, you had to embrace hierarchy, which means certain people are superior to others, have different statuses, okay, different social statuses, basically. And he also said you have to embrace morally upright behavior. One of his big things was children serving and submitting to their parents, okay? And his philosophy has been followed throughout Chinese history all the way to the present day. And there's even a religion, as I said, called Confucianism that's devoted to his teachings. He was a very wise person, right? Very wise person, and as I said, still has a big impact today. The major inventions, there were a lot of major inventions and developments during ancient China. Okay, most modern day inventions were invented by the United States, but if you look at most ancient inventions, a lot of them were invented by the Chinese. Okay, around 100 BC, the Chinese invented paper. Okay, something we are all using right now. Okay, paper, one of the most important inventions of all time, changed world history. Here's a picture of one of the first ever pieces of paper used for writing. All right. They also invented the kite. They also invented silk, which was really important for the Silk Road, which began during the Han Dynasty, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so the Han Dynasty was big into inventions, and there were also a lot of major inventions and developments during the Tang Dynasty. So in the 600s, a group of Chinese alchemists, which are basically people who try to turn different elements into gold, they tried to create an elixir, which is like a potion, for immortality. Now, obviously, they failed at this because they're, dead, but they inadvertently created gunpowder in the process. Now, could you imagine a world without gunpowder? How different everything would have been if gunpowder had not been invented. So this completely changed world history forever. Without gunpowder, we would probably still be fighting wars with swords and shields. All right. Now, the Chinese, during the Tang Dynasty, they also invented the toothbrush. There you see that thing that kind of looks like a broom. That is one of the first toothbrushes, or at least what one looked like. And they also invented fireworks once they invented or discovered gunpowder. So the ancient Chinese were very important to the field of history because they were one of the first civilizations to really see the value in studying history. They understood the value in studying the past, the people and events of the past, and the lessons we can learn from there. They strongly believed in learning from the past, and Chinese children were always taught the wisdom of what they called the sage emperors. Okay, and emperors in power, they always looked to previous emperors' actions and decisions and teachings for guidance. They had a large respect for their elders and for people who went before them, and just for history in general. One of the most impactful parts of ancient China that really stretched to the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere during the ancient world and into the Middle Ages was the Silk Road. So the Silk Road was an overland route that was comprised of two main routes. One of them connected the Mediterranean, okay, right here, and in turn Europe, to Central Asia. And the other one connected Central Asia to China. So you see this thing stretching thousands and thousands of miles across basically half of the globe. There was also a network of water routes that was added to the road. A major purpose of the Silk Road was not just travel, it's not just like people wanted to go on vacation, but the main purpose was trade. And this was in use for over a thousand years. It was in use from 120 BC until 1450 AD. All right, as I said, the purpose of the Silk Road was trade. The Silk Road radically expanded trade, and it changed the world in that way. Okay, now, or at that point with the Silk Road, okay, you no longer have to stay so localized. All right, before the Silk Road, if you came up with an invention or an idea, that stayed in your community. Okay, if you wanted a resource, you really couldn't get it if it wasn't grown in your community. But now, no matter where in the Western Hemisphere it is found, it can be traded, it can be transported all across the world. Now, one of the main items traded along the Silk Road, of course, was silk, is what it was named after. There are several reasons why silk was in high demand. Silk came from China. They're the ones who invented the process of making silk, and no one else knew how they did it. The Chinese kept their silk production process a secret. That way, they maintained control of the entire supply. They could have a monopoly on it, and they could really set their price. Okay, and since it was so rare and so exotic, and also because it was just pretty, silk became a status symbol, especially in Europe. Okay, silk is also very cool in the summer and very warm in the winter, serves a practical purpose. And because people loved silk so much, thought it was so pretty, so practical, so rare and exotic, China became super wealthy through the silk trade because everyone in Europe wanted silk and they were willing to pay big bucks for it. The Chinese also exported silver and iron along the Silk Road, and the Silk Road was really what made China so prosperous during this time. China was not the only was not the only exporter that used the Silk Road. There were a lot of other countries that also contributed goods that they traded across the world. For example, Mediterranean countries like Greece and Turkey and modern day Israel and Lebanon, they would export olives, olive oil, and wine because that grows naturally in the Mediterranean. And you also had India and other countries in South Asia exporting cotton and other textiles. And Arabia, modern day Saudi Arabia, exported incense and spices, right? So you have all of these different goods going all over the world and really improving people's lives, all right? Because now you can have all of these different things and experience all these things that you didn't get to experience before. The people who ran the operations along the land routes of the Silk Road were mostly nomads from Central Asia. Being a nomad or being nomadic, that means you don't have a permanent home. You just kind of wander from place to place wherever there's grazing land, wherever there's water, wherever there's food. Okay, and the nomads of Central Asia knew the terrain very well. They knew the mountains and the desert and how to get things from here to there. And they also had the equipment and the animals necessary to transport the goods across the continent. Camels were especially used because they had good hooves for walking on the sand, and they could also go a very long time without drinking water. And nomads really for the first time became very influential in world history because of how they connected the world together. And merchants like them became very wealthy because their services were so in high demand. The Silk Road is one of the earliest examples of what we call globalization, and that basically means the world metaphorically becoming smaller, okay? Meaning we don't feel all that different from people who live 1,000 miles away from us anymore because we can get there so quickly and we can trade things with them so quickly too. I mean, when you sat down for breakfast or lunch today, that is an example of globalization because all the food on your plate probably came from all over the world, or at least originated in different parts of the world. And that's globalization too, and the Silk Road was one of the first examples of that. Now, in addition to products being traded along the Silk Road, another thing that was traded was ideas. Okay? For example, Christianity and Western philosophy from the Greek philosophers, for example. That really made its way to the East. Okay? People in China had never heard of Jesus Christ before the Silk Road. They had never heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle before the Silk Road. But now with the Silk Road, you have all these merchants who heard about these people and about their teachings and brought back some writings, and they shared it with people in China. And then similarly, you had Buddhism and concepts like nirvana made their way to the West. Okay? People in Greece had never heard of Buddhism before the Silk Road. All right, so you have ideas really being exchanged here. Now, these ideas were not always accepted, but they did gain a lot more widespread exposure, and people became more cultured because they became more understanding and less ignorant of how things were across the country or across the world. Now, one of the most negative results of trade along the Silk Road was the spread of diseases. Okay, diseases were spread all along the Silk Road. Two of the most devastating examples were smallpox and measles. All right, these diseases did not remain in Europe either, okay, because as European explorers spread these sicknesses, as they explored North and South America, Native Americans got these sicknesses too, and a lot of that population was wiped out. So that's a huge negative of the Silk Road because, yes, while goods and ideas were exchanged along the Silk Road, you also had the merchants catching diseases from different countries and bringing it back to their home country where they may have infected people in that way. Okay? And that led to, in the age of exploration in the 1500s, Europeans giving it to the Native Americans too. Now, most notably, the Black Death, also known as the Plague or the second outbreak of the bubonic plague, this was spread along the Silk Road too, from fleas on rats that came from the Black Sea. And this disease killed about 1/3 of the world's population, a massive chunk of the world's population, and it probably would not have happened without the Silk Road. So when you think of history, when you think of major events or things like this in history, you always have to take the good with the bad. Okay, yes, the Silk Road did spread disease and killed many people, but at the same time, it really connected us in a way that we have not let go of ever since. And it spread ideas and it spread goods. Okay, so I'm not saying it was worth it necessarily, but that's not a decision we have to make. We just have to kind of analyze the good with the bad and compare and contrast in that way. All right, so that is ancient Greece and ancient China.